Over the last year, I've seen two different companies fold, my mother die, my marriage end. Also, I haven't written a single poem or read a book of poetry until now. This year, the two books of poetry that I've been most wanting to read for nearly a decade are now out. One book is the first book of poetry, Blank Oceans and Nameless Seas by Scott Brennan, the most sophisticated and aesthetic of all the young American poets writing today. The other book is the long-awaited decade of poems, Time and Materials, by perhaps the greatest American poet, Robert Hass. I read these two books simultaneously over the past few months, and I was struck by the phenomenal singularity and genius of these two voices. One respected and known, influencing a whole generation of writers. The other new and emergent, bursting onto the scene. They achieve singularity in their voices through the unspectacular move of mind rather than of flashy syntax or of cosmetic irregularities. At some level, we have all come to expect Hass to be such. What is phenomenal here is that he does not disappoint. With such expectation, it would be easy to fall flat or fall short, like so many poets as they age. They fall into a kind of unspectacular repose as a result of essentially success. So many of our greatest, once they turn the corner on 40, have essentially lost the edge, the will to maintain the discontent required for true artistic achievement. Maybe not discontent, maybe it's intensity. Most just begin to settle in. I'm happy to report that this is not the case with Hass. For in Time and Materials, we see several poems that constitute perhaps his greatest work yet, in a book that I think is his best ever. That being said, what is surprising is that in Brennan's poems, while different, they rival Hass in their sophistication, their beauty, their artfulness, and their quality of mind. As examples of this, I'm going to read poems from each. Each of them have, as Nietzsche pointed out, and as Joseph Campbell insists, a kind of romanticism that is not inclusive of resentment. That is, they understand form, they understand the pleasure of form, but they can easily exceed form and break form as a function of evolution. Whereas in 99% of the work we see out there, we see people throwing form away out of reaction rather than out of understanding of what it is and how it's done and what its function is in poetry. The first poem I'm going to read is from Hass. It is a poem called A Swarm of Dawns, a Flock of Restless Noons. There's a lot to be written in the Book of Errors. The elderly redactor is blind for all practical purposes. He has no imagination, and field mice have gnawed away his source text for their nesting. I loved you first, I think, when you stood in the kitchen sunlight and the lazy motes of summer dust while I sliced a nectarine from a Moroccan salad in the 7-league boots of your private grief. Maybe the syntax is a little haywire there. Left to itself, wire must act like Paul Klee with a pencil. Hay is the Old English word for strike. You strike down grass, I guess, when it is mown. Mown. The field mice devastated the monastery garden. Maybe because it was summer and the dusks were full of marsh hawks and the nights were soft with owls, they couldn't leave the herbs alone, gnawing the roots of rosemary, nibbling at sage and oregano and lemon thyme. It's too bad eglantine isn't an herb, because it's a word I'd like to use here. Her coloring was a hybrid of rubbed amber and the little flare of dawn rose in the kernel of an almond. It's a wonder to me that I have fingertips. The knife was very sharp. The scented rose orange moons, quarter moons, of fruit fell to the cutting board so neatly it was as if two people lived in separate cities and walked to their respective bakeries in the rain. Her bakery smelled better than his. The sour cloud of yeast from sourdough hung in the air like the odor of creation. They both bought sliced loaves. They both walked home. They both tripped in the entry to their separate kitchen, and the spilled slices made this exact same pattern on the floor. The nectarines smelled like the Book of Luck. There was a little fog off the bay at sundown in which the waning moon swam laps. The Miwoks called it Moon of the Only Credit Card. I would have given my fingertips to touch your cheekbone, and I did. The monk knocked off early. He was making it all up anyway, and he had a bit of verse. That was A Swarm of Dawns, A Flock of Restless Noons. And now I'd like to read a poem from Scott Brennan's Blank Oceans, Nameless Seas. Scott Brennan's Blank Oceans and Nameless Seas is a book that reminds me of how Hass has influenced our generation of poets. It's the kind of influence that doesn't ask for mimics as much as it encourages an evolution of the consciousness of both the art and the mind. This is a poem called The Ghosts of Mexico City by Scott Brennan. The idea of flying home 3 days from now has transformed me into one of the ghosts of Mexico City. And the woman I made love to over the past 2 months, the sexy Italian I seduced while painting bar murals, it has changed her into a ghost as well, especially when she walks beside me, holding my hand, while the toothless old prostitute in the carrot-colored wig, a bag of skin on the steps of El Hotel Maria, our hotel, cackles into her bottle of red wine. The old whore is the queen of the street corner ghouls, but my woman, well, she's someone special, an angel spun out of silver light who will whisper to me later over fried eggs and coffee, my eyes bleeding with hangover, the sweat dripping down my cheeks like the tears she'll shed for me after I've gone, and she's numbing her memories with mezcal and cocaine, smoking more and more cigarettes, and laughing into the keen ear of the mariachi she'll let take her home because he sings the sweetest songs. Every time I look to the sky, the gods shake the ground, and I believe they are coming. The buildings lean and crumble, raise a little dust. Everywhere there are ghosts gluing themselves back together with dust. The cathedral is haunted, and the boy selling braids of garlic on a towel, his sole means of commerce, is a shade. Everyone who sells something precious will be brought back to life. Consider these 2 books, Time and Materials by Robert Hass, Blank Oceans and Nameless Seas by Scott Brennan. They're perhaps the 2 best books I've read in a decade. Their understanding of why poetry matters is what seems most significant to me. Enjoy them.